The plastic chair in the emergency room dug into the back of my legs while my mother slept beside me with wires on her chest and an oxygen tube under her nose. My phone buzzed. Mark, can't talk. Working late again. Big client. Don't late up. I stared at the text until the letters blurred. My mother had nearly collapsed in the grocery store an hour earlier. The doctor had said the words possible heart event, and all I wanted was my husband beside me for 5 minutes. 5. But he was working late. Again. Then the TV hanging in the corner switched to breaking news. A luxury apartment building downtown was on fire. Smoke poured out of a top-floor balcony. People were screaming below. The camera shook as firefighters rushed in. And then a man stepped into the frame carrying a little boy in his arms. My whole body went cold. It was Mark, not in work clothes, not in the blue button-down he wore to the office. He was in a dark sweater I had never seen before, his hair damp with sweat, his face streaked with smoke, and clinging to his arm was a pregnant woman in a cream coat. The little boy wrapped both arms around Mark's neck and cried, "Daddy, don't let go." I stood up so fast my chair flipped backward. The reporter pushed a microphone toward them. Adrian Wells helped get his family out just before the fire spread to the nursery. Family. I stopped breathing. My mother opened her eyes at the sound of the chair hitting the floor. "Claire?" she whispered. "What happened?" I pointed at the screen with a shaking hand, but I couldn't get the words out. Because the man on the TV, my husband, the man who said he was buried in paperwork and meetings and deadlines, had one hand around another woman's waist, and she was looking at him like he was the only safe thing left in the world. And that wasn't even the part that broke me. The part that broke me was how natural he looked. No panic, no surprise, no guilt. Just a husband holding his son while his pregnant wife leaned into him. As if I had never existed at all. I kept waiting for the camera to cut away, for the reporter to correct herself, for Mark to look up and laugh and explain it was some misunderstanding so ridiculous I'd hate myself for even thinking the worst. But he didn't. He kissed the little boy's head. The woman touched his chest and said something too soft for the mic to catch. And Mark looked at her with a tenderness I hadn't seen in months, maybe longer. I didn't know it yet, but the life I thought I was protecting in that emergency room had already burned down. I was just the last person to smell the smoke. I had been married to Mark for 5 years. At least, that was what I believed. We met when I was 28 and still trying to figure out how to breathe after my father died. He had this steady voice, this way of looking at me like my sadness didn't scare him. Everyone else wanted me to move on. Mark let me sit in the mess of it. He brought groceries without asking questions. He fixed my kitchen faucet. He held me when grief made me ugly and silent and impossible. When he proposed, my mother cried and said, "Your father would have liked him." I cried too. Back then, I thought that meant something. The first 2 years were good, not perfect, but warm. We rented a small townhouse with thin walls and a broken dryer, and we used to laugh over takeout on the floor, because we hadn't bought a proper dining table yet. He kissed me in the kitchen. He called me on lunch breaks. He knew how I took my coffee, and he remembered the anniversary of my father's death without being told. Then my aunt passed away and left me a small inheritance. Nothing flashy. Just enough to pay off old debt, maybe start fresh, maybe breathe a little easier. Mark had a dream then. A property business, small investments, home flips, short-term rentals. He said if we were smart, really smart, we could build something of our own. He looked so hopeful when he talked about it that I didn't hesitate. I gave him most of the inheritance. I told myself that's what marriage was. Trust. Belief. Building together. I didn't notice how quickly ours became his. He became busier. More calls, more dinners with clients. More nights where he texted after 9 and said not to wait up. Whenever I asked questions, he'd kiss my forehead and say, "This is temporary, Claire. I'm doing this for us." And maybe I would have kept believing him if pain hadn't made me pay attention. Because while he was building whatever life he was living, I was losing mine in quiet pieces. There was the miscarriage 12 months earlier, the one he barely talked about afterward. There were fertility appointments he stopped coming to because of closing deadlines. There was my mother getting weaker, pretending she was fine while her hands trembled over teacups. And there was me, sitting alone in waiting rooms, making excuses for a man I loved more than I understood. But that night in the hospital, every excuse I had ever made for Mark came back and turned to ash. I took out my phone and recorded the TV screen with trembling hands. He was there, clear as day. The reporter said, authorities believe the fire started in a utility closet on the 12th floor. Residents Adrian Wells, his wife Sarah, and their young son were among those evacuated. Sarah, young son, wife. I replayed the clip 3 times like repetition might change reality. It didn't. On the 4th time, my mother reached for my wrist. Claire, she said, her voice fragile. Who is that? I swallowed so hard it hurt. I don't know. That was my first lie. Not to protect Mark. To protect myself. Because if I said the truth out loud right then, in that bright hospital room with antiseptic in the air and my mother hooked to monitors, I thought I might actually come apart. And the worst part was, I still wanted him to have an explanation, even after the child called him daddy. Even after the reporter called that woman his wife. Even after I saw his hand on her stomach like it belonged there. That's what love does when it has been fed with hope and excuses for too long. It makes you beg reality to be kinder than it is. Around midnight, Mark walked into the hospital carrying a paper cup of coffee and a face full of concern. I came as soon as I could, he said. I looked at him so hard I thought my eyes might cut through skin. He had changed clothes. He was back in his office shirt. His hair was damp, like he'd showered in a hurry. There was a red mark on his wrist, the kind a child might leave when holding on too tight. He kissed my cheek. I turned my face away. He paused. What's wrong? I held up my phone and played the video. He didn't move at first. Didn't blink. Didn't speak. And in that tiny pause less than 2 seconds, maybe I saw the truth. Not the whole truth, but enough. He knew exactly what I had seen. Then his face softened into something almost offended. Claire? Seriously? My fingers tightened around the phone. Seriously? It's not what you think. There it was, the oldest line in the world, still somehow sharp enough to draw blood. I stood up and kept my voice low because my mother was sleeping. The reporter called you her husband. That little boy called you daddy. He glanced toward my mother's bed, then lowered his voice too. That building belongs to an investor I'm working with. I was there for a late meeting. The fire started, people panicked, and I helped them get out. The news got names mixed up in the chaos. I stared at him. He sighed, like I was the difficult one. Claire, come on. You know how live TV works. Do I? I whispered. Because from where I was standing, it looks like my husband was in another woman's apartment, while I was in the ER with my mother. His jaw tightened. So now I'm not allowed to work with female clients? That child called you daddy. He was scared. And your hand was on her stomach. She almost fell. I felt my chest start to shake. Then why did they call you Adrian Wells? That hit him. I saw it, but only for a second. He rubbed his forehead and said, the producer must have mixed my name with someone else's. Claire, you're exhausted. Your mom is in the hospital. You saw something upsetting and now you're spinning it into something bigger. I should have screamed. Instead, I did what women like me are trained to do when a man speaks calmly enough. I doubted myself. Only for a moment, but still. And then he made it worse. He touched my arm and said softly, You've been under a lot of stress since the fertility treatments. I know this has been hard on you. I pulled my arm away so fast he looked surprised. Not because he mentioned the treatments, because he used my pain like a weapon. That was the moment something in me cracked open. Not fully, not enough to free me yet, but enough to let the light in. The next morning, after my mother was moved to observation and Mark left to handle a meeting, I called the station that aired the segment. I told the woman who answered that I needed a copy of the fire coverage because my relative had been involved. That part wasn't technically a lie. She transferred me twice before I reached a reporter named Nina. Her voice was quick and tired, like someone who lived on caffeine and deadlines. We don't usually send raw footage to private individuals. I just need to confirm something, I said. Silence. Then she asked, was your relative one of the residents? I looked down at the video frozen on my phone. Mark holding that little boy like he'd done it 1,000 times. Yes, I said. I think so. Nina must have heard something in my voice because hers changed. What name are you trying to confirm? I almost said Mark. Instead I said Adrian Wells. Paper rustled on her end. Keyboard clicks. That was the name given at the scene? Why? My throat closed. Because, I said slowly, I know him by another name. There was a pause long enough to feel dangerous. And then Nina said, very carefully, can you meet me? I didn't know it then, but that phone call was the first good decision I had made in months. We met at a coffee shop across from the station that afternoon. Nina was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with sharp eyes and a notebook already open before I sat down. I showed her the wedding photo on my phone. She looked from the picture to my face, then back again. That's him, she said. My husband. Are you sure? The question should have offended me, but it didn't, because that was the problem. I wasn't sure of anything anymore except what I had seen. Yes, I said. That's Mark Dalton. She wrote the name down. The woman at the scene identified him as Adrian Wells. I let out a laugh that sounded too close to crying. Then one of us married a stranger. Nina asked a few careful questions. How long we'd been together, where he worked, whether I had ever seen ID with another name, whether anything else had felt off lately. I started answering, and once I started, I couldn't stop. The late nights, the hidden phone calls, the way our joint savings had thinned without clear reasons, the missing patients, the missacations, the miscarriage he refused to talk about, the way he had made me feel unstable in the hospital instead of hurt. Nina listened without interrupting. Finally, she said, I'm not saying this is definitely a criminal story, but I am saying names don't usually get invented out of thin air. Someone gave us that name on purpose. My skin prickled. What if it really is an affair? I asked. What if I'm making it something bigger because I can't handle how small and ugly the truth is? Nina closed her notebook. Claire, she said, men having affairs don't usually use a second full identity at a fire scene. I went cold all over again. And then everything changed. That night, Mark came home with flowers. Yellow tulips, my favorite. If he had brought them any other week, I might have cried and forgiven him before he even spoke. But now I just stared at the petals and thought about how easily he chose props. I hate that we fought, he said. You didn't deserve that. I folded my arms. Then tell me the truth. I already did. He said it so smoothly I almost admired him. He put the flowers in water himself, then turned and gave me the patient smile people use on frightened children. You want the full boring version? Fine. The woman from the building, Sarah, is married to a guy named Adrian. He wasn't home when the fire started. I got the little boy out, and people were confused. Someone must have assumed I was the husband. That's it. Why were you in her apartment? I told you. Business. At 9:30 at night? Some of us actually work late, Claire. I flinched. He saw it, and for one split second I think he regretted it, but only because he needed me soft. He stepped closer. Look at me. Have I ever given you a reason not to trust me? I wanted to say yes. Instead I said, I don't know anymore. He exhaled like I was exhausting him. You're grieving your mom's health. You've been carrying a lot. Maybe we need to take a weekend away, go to the lake house, just the two of us. Reset. Lake house. The little cabin outside the city he had recently insisted on renting for business retreats. At the time, I thought it was another one of his impulsive ideas. Standing there in my kitchen, I wondered who else he had taken there. or what else he had planned there. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part came after he showered. His phone buzzed on the counter while he was upstairs. I didn't mean to look. At least that's what I told myself later. But the screen lit up, and I saw a message preview before it disappeared. Leo finally stopped crying. He keeps asking where Daddy went. I stopped breathing. Leo. Not the child. Not her son. Leo. Mark had a name for him. And that meant the boy had a place in his life. When Mark came back down, I was sitting at the table with his phone in front of me. He froze. "Who's Leo?" His eyes dropped to the phone, then to my face. Slowly, he smiled. Not warmly. Not kindly. Just enough to tell me he was done pretending innocence. "A kid from the building," he said. "Then why is his mother texting you?" "She's upset. Their apartment is damaged." "Why does he call you Daddy?" He leaned one hand on the chair across from me and said in a quiet voice, "Because I told him to." I stared at him. My skin turned to ice. He kept talking. He was in shock. Kids latch on to the nearest adult. I played along to calm him down. That's what decent people do. It sounded almost believable. That was what terrified me most. He could take a lie, polish it, warm it between his hands, and hand it back like comfort. I knew then that if I stayed still, he would rewrite reality until I disappeared inside it. So the next day, I followed him. I parked 2 cars behind his black SUV and kept my hands so tight on the steering wheel they hurt. He drove past downtown, past his office, past every place he had ever claimed to be headed when he worked late. He crossed the river and turned into a quiet neighborhood lined with expensive townhomes and clean sidewalks. He parked in front of a gray 3-story building with white trim. Then he got out carrying a toy bag. A toy bag. I watched him ring the bell like he belonged there. The door opened before the second chime. The same pregnant woman from the news. Sarah smiled the second she saw him. Not surprised, not confused. Relieved. The little boy ran into the hallway and launched himself at Mark's legs. Mark bent, lifted him up, kissed his cheek, and said, "Hey, buddy." Then he kissed Sarah. Not a mistake. Not panic. Not confusion. A kiss you give someone you've been touching for a very long time. I don't remember pulling over after that. I just remember the taste of metal in my mouth and the sound of myself making these awful animal noises into the steering wheel. I had imagined affairs before in the way lonely wives do when the lies get too regular, but imagination is still a kind of distance. What I saw through that windshield had no distance at all. My husband had another home. Another woman. Another child who ran to him like love had never been broken. I sat there for nearly 20 minutes before someone tapped on my passenger window. I jumped so hard I nearly screamed. It was an older woman with silver curls and a grocery bag hanging from one arm. She pointed toward the line of parked cars for residents and made a polite motion for me to move. I rolled the window down a few inches and apologized. She peered at me. "You all right, honey? You look pale." I glanced toward the townhouse. Mark was gone inside. "I'm fine," I lied. The woman followed my eyes, then looked back at me with the expression of someone who suddenly understood too much. "You here for Adrian?" My heart slammed. "What?" She shifted the grocery bag and lowered her voice. "I don't mean to pry. I just see him come and go. Nice enough man. Quiet. His wife's sweet. Little boy is adorable. Wife." I couldn't speak. The woman gave me a sad look. "I'm sorry, I thought you knew." I drove away before she could say another word. Halfway home, my phone rang. "Nina." I nearly ignored it, but something made me answer. "Claire?" My voice came out hollow. "You were right." There was a pause. "You found him?" "With her." "With the child." Nina didn't say, "I'm sorry," right away. I appreciated that. Sorry was too small for what I was feeling. Instead, she asked, "Can you talk?" I pulled into an empty church parking lot and cried so hard I couldn't see. Nina stayed on the line while I tried to breathe. When I finally calmed down enough to speak, she said, I ran the name Mark Dalton, then Adrian Wells. Neither line is clean. What does that mean? It means one of those identities is paper thin. No childhood address, no consistent employment records before a few years ago. I found business filings connected to Mark, but most are dissolved. A few complaints too. Financial disputes. My eyes burned. So he's a liar, I know that. It may be more than that. Those words landed differently. More than that? More than betrayal, more than cheating. I wiped my face. What are you saying? I'm saying I think you need to be careful. I laughed once, bitter and broken. A little late for that. No, Nina said. I mean right now. That night I didn't confront Mark. I wanted to. God, I wanted to throw plates and photos and the whole marriage in his face. But something had shifted. The man in my kitchen, the man in that townhouse, the man on the TV. They were all the same person. And I suddenly understood I had no idea what he was capable of. So I played quiet. I made dinner. I asked about his day. I let him kiss my forehead. Every second of it made me feel sick. After he fell asleep, I went into his home office with a flashlight and started opening drawers. The first two held boring things: printer paper, chargers, stale pens. The third was locked. Of course it was. I stood there staring at it, then went downstairs, grabbed a butter knife, and came back. It took 6 minutes and one broken nail, but the drawer finally gave. Inside were 3 things that changed the shape of my life. A second phone, a stack of bank envelopes, and a folder with my name on it. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped the folder. Inside were copies of my driver's license, my social security card, life insurance forms, and a recent appraisal of my house, the one I inherited after my father died, the one Mark had always called our safety net. There was a sticky note on top in his handwriting. Increase after cabin trip. I stopped breathing, not because I understood everything, because I understood enough. And then I saw the insurance beneficiary line. Mark Dalton, 100%. I don't know how long I sat on the floor with that folder in my lap, staring at my own name like it belonged to a dead woman. Cabin trip. Increase after cabin trip. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. Maybe. But once the idea entered my mind, everything else rushed in behind it. The smoke detectors he'd said were malfunctioning, the way he recently asked if I had updated my will, the sudden sweetness, the weekend away, the tulips. All of it rearranged itself into something cold and deliberate. I called Nina at 2014 in the morning. She answered on the second ring. Tell me everything, she said. By noon the next day, I was standing on a stranger's porch, with my heart beating so hard I thought the woman inside might hear it through the wood. Sarah opened the door wearing leggings, an oversized sweater, and the kind of exhausted expression only pregnancy and stress can create. Up close, she looked softer than she had on TV. Younger too. A few freckles. No makeup. Real. She smiled politely. Can I help you? I had rehearsed a dozen speeches in the car. In every version I was strong, controlled, clear. What came out was, I think we're sleeping with the same man. Her face emptied. For a second, neither of us moved. Then, from somewhere inside the house, the little boy yelled, Mom, where's my blue truck? Sarah's hand flew protectively to her stomach. I think you have the wrong house, she said. I wish I did. I pulled out my phone and showed her the wedding photo. Me and Mark. White dress. Suit. His hand at my waist. Smile so bright they hurt to look at now. She stared at the screen. Then she looked up at me. And whispered, That's Adrian. My eyes filled instantly. His name is Mark. She stepped back like I had pushed her. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the man on your couch at night and in my bed for the last 5 years. Leo appeared in the hallway then, holding a toy truck, his face open and innocent. He looked from me to Sarah and sensed something wrong immediately. Mom. Sarah knelt and sent him to his room with a cartoon and a snack. Her hands were shaking. Mine too. When she came back, she didn't invite me in right away. She asked one question first. How long? 7 years together, I said. 5 married. She closed her eyes. Then she moved aside. We sat at her kitchen table with a pitcher of water between us like civilized women discussing anything but the destruction of their lives. At first it was just pain traded in pieces. How long had we known him? Where we met? What he said he did for work? What excuses he used when he disappeared? Every answer made the next one worse. Then Sarah stood up without a word, walked to a drawer, and came back with a folder. She opened it and slid a marriage certificate across the table. Her hands were trembling so badly the paper rattled. I looked down. There he was, Mark Anthony Dalton. Not Adrian, Mark. Same face, same signature curve in the M, same man. Married to Sarah Whitmore 14 months earlier. Legally filed. Official seal. County stamp. I looked up at her, numb. He used his real name with you. Her mouth opened, then closed again. What do you mean? I reached into my bag and took out my own wedding certificate, the one I had framed years ago before moving it to a drawer. I had never studied it closely because, why would I? Sarah did. And then she frowned. This isn't filed. My stomach dropped. She pointed to the bottom. There's no county stamp, no registration number. I snatched it back and stared. She was right. It was a ceremonial certificate from the chapel, not the legal filing. I remembered asking Mark for the official copy once, maybe twice. He had laughed and said the courthouse was behind after renovations. Later he said they had mailed it. Later still he said he'd handle it. He never did. Because he never intended to. I wasn't his wife, I was just a rehearsal. Or worse, a target. The room tilted. Sarah grabbed my wrist before I slid off the chair. Claire. I looked at her and started laughing. Not because anything was funny, because if I didn't laugh, I would scream so hard the neighbors might call the police. I gave him my inheritance, I said, and the words came out broken. I put his business in motion. I let him build a life with money my father left me. Sarah went white. What? I told her about the money. She told me about the condo. He had convinced her to co-sign on a luxury apartment because he said flipping high-end rentals would double their future before the baby came. The fire on the news? It had started in a locked utility closet. Investigators said it looked electrical, but Sarah had thought something felt wrong because Mark had been acting strange all week. Then she said something that made both of us go still. Last Tuesday, she whispered, I told him I wanted to look over all our paperwork. I said if we were about to have a baby together, I needed to know where everything stood. I felt a chill climb up my spine. And the fire happened 3 days later, I said. She nodded. Neither of us spoke, because the same thought had arrived for both of us. What if the fire wasn't an accident? I didn't know what was coming next, but I knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just a story about a lying husband. It was a story about survival. Mina met us that evening in her car outside a grocery store parking lot because none of us trusted enclosed spaces anymore. She listened while Sarah explained the fire, while I showed the insurance note, while both of us filled in the blanks of Mark's disappearing acts. Nina's face got tighter with every detail. Finally, she said, I've been digging since last night. There's another name connected to him in Arizona. Different woman. Similar pattern. Quick romance. Financial entanglement. Then he vanished after a car accident settlement. Sarah covered her mouth. I felt sick. How many? I asked. I don't know yet. Nina tapped her notebook. But enough for me to say this out loud. You need law enforcement, not just heartbreak. We did go to the police. And like too many women before us, we learned how slowly danger moves when it wears a nice smile and a clean shirt. The officer took notes. Fraud, possible arson concerns, identity issues. He nodded at the papers. He said words like follow-up and documentation and civil matter, pending evidence. He was polite. He was calm. And he sent us home. Mark came back that night with takeout and a soft voice. You look tired, he said. I wondered if predators could smell fear. He set down the food and touched my cheek. Still upset with me? I held his gaze and forced myself not to shake. I've just had a lot on my mind. He smiled. That's why we need that weekend. You and me. No phones, no stress. No witnesses, I thought. I almost threw up right there in the kitchen. Instead, I said, maybe. He leaned in and kissed my forehead like a blessing. I had once loved that gesture. Now it felt like a hand over my mouth. The next day, Sarah called me from inside Mark's storage unit. She had found the key taped under his desk drawer after remembering a strange monthly charge on their account. Nina drove with her to the unit while I stayed home in case Mark checked in. When Sarah video called me, her face looked gray. "Claire," she whispered and turned the camera. I thought I was ready for anything. I wasn't. Inside that unit were labeled plastic bins, not business inventory, women, not their bodies, the leftovers of their lives. Photo albums, jewelry boxes, old phones, copied IDs, handwritten letters, folders with names, some I didn't recognize, one I did mine. There were rings in small velvet boxes, chapel brochures from different states, blank beneficiary forms, lease agreements, insurance packets, burner phones sealed in plastic. It was a system. He had a system. He had a system. Nina's voice came from behind Sarah. "Don't touch anything else. I'm photographing everything." Then Sarah lifted one more folder and my blood turned cold. On the tab was written, "Claire, Phase 3, Phase 3. I felt my knees weaken. "What's in it?" I asked. Sarah opened it with trembling hands. They were copies of my house appraisal, life insurance increases, cabin rental confirmations, and printed directions to the property with my name and Mark's written across the top. At the bottom of one page, in his handwriting, were 4 words: "Weekend ideal, no neighbors. No neighbors." I went so still I could hear the clock ticking in my own house. The house my father bought. The house Mark had probably been measuring for profit since the day he first kissed me in the doorway. But the folder held something even worse. A small prescription bottle in an evidence bag. No label. Just a pharmacy sticker partly peeled away. And a note paper clipped to the back. "Use if needed. Past issue effective." Sarah looked confused. Nina didn't. "What past issue?" I asked. Nina's expression changed. "Claire, when you lost the baby, was anything unusual?" The room tilted again. I opened my mouth, but for a second nothing came out. Then memory returned like a blade. The dizziness. The bleeding that started too early. The vitamins Mark used to hand me every night because he said I always forgot. The way he insisted on picking up my prescriptions after appointments because he was already out. My fingers went numb. "No," I whispered. Then louder, "No." Because once that door opened, too many moments rushed through. After the miscarriage, I had asked the doctor if stress could have caused it. She said early loss can happen for many reasons. No one's fault. No clear answer. Mark held me and cried with me that night. He cried. I had called him kind for that. I folded in half and pressed a hand to my mouth. Sarah's voice shook. "Claire," I couldn't speak. Nina took over. "Listen to me. We don't know what that bottle means yet, but we do know he's planning something at that cabin. That's enough. Enough." It should have been enough. But then came the truth behind the truth. And it almost destroyed me. Mina found the Arizona woman 2 days later. She wasn't dead. Her name was Emily Hart, and she was living in a rehab center outside Phoenix after a car crash 3 years earlier left her with nerve damage and memory gaps. Nina got a statement through Emily's sister, then put her on speaker for me and Sarah. Emily's voice was thin but steady. When Nina mentioned Mark Dalton, Emily started crying before the first question was finished. "He told me his name was Ben," she said. "We had a ceremony in Sedona. Not legal, I found out later. He moved in fast. Asked about my grandmother's land. Said we should put everything in both our names because that's what couples do." My hands were ice. Sarah was crying silently beside me. Emily kept talking. "I got pregnant. He was different after that. Distant, angry. Then I lost the baby at 10 weeks. A month later, my brakes failed on a mountain road. No one in the room breathed. My sister always thought he did it, Emily whispered. But there was no proof. He disappeared before I got out of the hospital. I closed my eyes. There it was, the pattern. Not just stolen money. Erased women. Erased children. Erased children. Erased futures. When the call ended, Sarah broke down completely. She slid to the floor with both hands over her stomach, sobbing. My son was in that fire. Leo was in that fire. I knelt beside her and held her while she shook. For the first time since this nightmare began, my grief made room for rage. Not helpless, drowning rage, clean rage, useful rage, the kind that sharpens. Mark had counted on our silence, our shame, our confusion. He had counted on us blaming ourselves, on police shrugging, on paperwork taking too long, on trauma making us forget details. He had counted on the same thing men like him always count on, that women in pain will turn inward instead of outward. He was wrong. And then everything moved fast. Nina took the storage unit evidence to an arson investigator she trusted from a previous story. The investigator, a woman named Detective Ramos, didn't smile much, didn't waste time, and didn't treat any of us like we were hysterical. She looked through the photographs, the insurance notes, the burner phones, the Arizona statement, and Mark's plans for the cabin. Then she said, "We don't wait." Those 3 words felt like air returning to my lungs. The plan was simple and terrifying. I would agree to the weekend. I would wear a wire. Ramos wanted probable cause strong enough to move immediately: admission, action, threat, anything that tied Mark to intent. Officers would be nearby. Sarah and Nina would stay with Ramos in an unmarked car down the road. Every part of me wanted to refuse. Every part of me also knew if I didn't face him now, he would keep moving, keep lying, keep finding new women to bury under his future. So when Mark smiled and said, "Still up for the cabin," I smiled back and said, "Yes." He looked genuinely pleased. That was the hardest part. Not the lie. The fact that he still thought I was weak enough to believe him. We drove out Saturday afternoon under a clear sky so beautiful it felt insulting. Mark hummed along to the radio. He reached over once and squeezed my knee like we were a couple in a commercial. I wanted to rip his hand off. Instead, I stared out the window and counted my breaths. When we got to the cabin, the woods were quiet, too quiet. Pines on every side. No neighboring lights. No close road. Exactly what he had written in the folder. Ideal. No neighbors. He brought in the bags and opened a bottle of wine. "For us," he said. I looked at the glass he poured me and thought of unlabeled pills. "I'm not drinking tonight," I said. He held my gaze for one beat too long, then smiled. Probably smart, probably. He had already stopped pretending, even if he thought I hadn't noticed. We ate in silence at the small wooden table. Around sunset, he lit the fireplace even though the room wasn't cold. I watched the flames and felt my pulse in my throat. Finally he said, "You've been distant." I set down my fork. "Have I?" "Yes." He leaned back in his chair. "Ever since the hospital. You look at me like you don't know me." The truth rose to my lips. I let it. "That's because I don't." He went still. Outside, the wind pressed lightly against the windows. Inside my sweater, the wire felt like a second heartbeat. Mark folded his hands. "What do you think you know, Claire?" I stood up and took the papers from my bag one by one. The insurance form, the cabin directions, the marriage certificate to Sarah, a photo of the storage unit. I laid them on the table between us. At first he didn't react. Then a smile touched the corner of his mouth. Not panic. Amusement. "Well," he said softly, "that's inconvenient." Something about the calmness of that response snapped the last piece of fear in me. "Inconvenient," I whispered. "You lied to me for years." He shrugged. "You made it easy." The words hit me harder than a slap. I felt the old version of myself break apart right there. The woman who begged for explanations. The woman who thought love could make cruelty reasonable. Gone. I stepped closer. Did you ever love me? He looked almost bored. Claire, you were grieving, lonely, and sitting on a paid-off house. Let's not romanticize this. I don't remember moving, but suddenly my hand hit the table so hard the glasses rattled. You used my father's money. You offered it. You let me think we were trying for a baby while you— He cut in, sharp now. That wasn't part of the plan. The room went silent. I heard my own voice as if from far away. What wasn't? He stood slowly. The baby. Everything in me turned to ice. You told me to take those vitamins, I said. He said nothing. Didn't deny it. Didn't comfort. Just watched me understand. I started backing away from the table. You killed my baby. His expression hardened. Don't be dramatic. Early losses happen all the time. That was the confession. Not neat, not full, but enough. Tears flooded my eyes anyway. Not weak tears, murderous ones. What about Emily? I asked. What about Sarah? What about Leo in that fire? At Emily's name, something mean flashed across his face. Emily got clingy. Sarah got curious. And you— He gave a low laugh. You were supposed to stay grateful. I heard movement outside then. A distant crunch of tires on gravel. He heard it too. His eyes flicked toward the window. In 1 second, the room changed. He knew. Who did you bring? He said. I kept backing up. People who finally believe me. His face twisted into something I had never seen before and yet suddenly recognized completely. This was the real man, not the tender one, not the patient one, not the one who brought tulips. This one. He crossed the room so fast I barely had time to scream before he grabbed my arm and slammed me against the wall. You stupid woman, he hissed. The impact knocked the air out of me. He clamped a hand over my mouth and dragged me toward the fireplace. I bit him. Hard. He shouted and let go for 1 second long enough for me to reach the iron poker leaning beside the hearth. When he lunged again, I swung. The poker hit his shoulder with a sickening thud. He stumbled, cursed, and knocked the wine bottle off the table. It shattered across the floor. Then the front door burst open. Police! Don't move. Mark spun toward the sound. Detective Ramos entered first, weapon raised, 2 officers behind her. Sarah was just outside, white-faced, one hand over her mouth, Nina gripping her elbow. For 1 wild second, I thought it was over. Then Mark grabbed the kerosene can by the fireplace. I hadn't even noticed it there. Of course it was there. He slung it toward the flames. Ramos yelled. The room exploded with heat. Fire climbed the rug in a rush. Mark bolted for the back door. An officer tackled him before he made it 3 steps. I stumbled away coughing as smoke thickened instantly. Ramos grabbed my arm and hauled me outside. Cold air hit my lungs like knives. Behind us, officers dragged Mark onto the gravel while another radioed the fire team. He was shouting now. Furious. Thrashing, no longer charming, no longer careful, just ugly, just caught. He saw me standing there wrapped in a police blanket, Sarah beside me, and screamed, You think you won? You were nothing before me. I wiped blood from my lip and looked him dead in the eye. No, I said. I was nothing to you. He kept yelling as they shoved him into the cruiser. Fraud. Arson. Attempted murder. Identity crimes. Insurance crimes. The list grew over the next few days, then weeks. Detective Ramos found enough in that storage unit to bury him. Emily's statement strengthened the case. Sarah's documents. My wire. The fire investigation. The life insurance changes. Everything he had built so carefully turned into evidence against him. And the news? The same station that once showed him as a smoke-covered hero ran his arrest photo across every screen in the city. This time, I watched without shaking. My mother recovered slowly. Sarah moved in with her sister until the baby came. Leo started sleeping through the night again after a while. though loud sirens still scared him. Emily agreed to testify remotely when the time came. Nina won an award for the story, though she joked the only thing she really wanted was 8 uninterrupted hours of sleep and a decent sandwich. As for me, I spent months untangling paperwork and years of lies. Some days were brutal. Learning that my marriage had never legally existed felt like losing it twice. Realizing my miscarriage might not have been an accident hollowed me out in ways I still can't fully describe. There were mornings I woke up angry, afternoons I woke up ashamed, and nights I woke up grateful to simply still be alive. Healing wasn't clean, but it was honest. And honest was better than anything Mark ever gave me. At sentencing, he wore the same face he used to wear at dinner parties, the harmless one, the polished one, the man people trusted too easily. But charm looks small when stacked against evidence. The judge called him calculated, predatory, remorseless. I called him by his real title when it was my turn to speak. Coward. He never looked at me while I read my statement. That bothered me once. By then, it only made him smaller. After court, Sarah handed me a cup of coffee and laughed through tears when I finally took a sip without checking it first. Months later, when her baby girl was born, she asked me to come to the hospital. I was the second person to hold her. Tiny, furious, alive. Leo climbed into my lap and whispered, "She's really loud." I laughed for the first time in what felt like years. "She gets that from your mom," I told him. Sarah smiled at me over the baby's head, tired and strong and still here. So was I. People ask me sometimes when I first knew the truth. Was it the TV screen in the emergency room? The little boy calling my husband daddy? The folder in the locked drawer? The second woman with the legal marriage certificate? The answer is all of it and none of it. Because truth rarely arrives in one clean blow. Usually it taps first. A late text, a missing document, a story that doesn't sit right in your bones. Then one day, it stops tapping and kicks the door in. That night, I thought the news had destroyed my life, but it didn't. It interrupted a lie before it could finish killing me. And if there is any lesson worth carrying from what happened, it's this. The moment someone works hardest to make you doubt your own eyes, your own memory, your own pain, that is the moment you need to trust yourself the most. I lost a marriage that never existed. I lost a future I had begged to keep. I lost the woman who thought love meant enduring anything. But I found something better in the fire he set for me. I found the version of myself he could not deceive, drug, shame, or silence. The version that survived. So if you ever hear that little voice inside you whispering that something is wrong, do not smother it just because the person hurting you has a gentle tone and a believable smile. Listen. Listen early. Listen hard. Because sometimes the worst night of your life is also the night that saves it. And the man I saw in the news that night was never my husband at all. He was just the warning I almost ignored.